Now we've got the chair of the FTC, Lina Khan. Thanks so much for joining me again.
Thanks for having me.
So you have overseen an historically successful and effective tenure at the FTC, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. But first, I do want to talk about Trump's priorities for the FTC in light of him tapping Andrew Ferguson to lead the commission. So how do you expect the FTC's priorities to change under the commission's new leadership?
I can't predict what a future administration is going to do. I will say, based on my own experience, it has been quite striking that even in very partisan times in Washington, D.C., anti-monopoly and antitrust has been deeply bipartisan, right? I mean, we have seen real interest on both sides of the aisle on taking on unchecked monopoly power, corporate law breaking. And so I would hope that that would continue. I would hope we would see vigorous enforcement. And I would hope that we would see a continued commitment to enforcing the law without fear or favor. And that last part is incredibly important, right? I mean, as law enforcers, we only have credibility if we show that we're being impartial in that way.
Ferguson's pitch for himself, one part of it was to, quote, reverse Lina Khan's anti-business agenda. But your agenda has been focused on, for example, challenging Kroger's acquisition of Albertsons, which would have been the largest grocery store merger in America, and actually would have hurt competition and therefore hurt business. So how do you square those two things?
We've been incredibly active in enforcing the law and wanting to make sure that competition is serving Americans. I mean, as you noted, the Kroger Albertsons deal would have been the largest supermarket merger in history. As our complaint noted, this would have meant that people were paying higher prices at the grocery store if this deal went through, and that the grocery store employees would be worse off. As the trial went on, we heard from people in the communities, the workers. I did listening sessions across the country, including in places like Las Vegas, Phoenix, Colorado. And people noted that prior big grocery deals that had gone through left their communities worse off. So this is about enforcing the law. It's about making sure Americans have access to affordable groceries, affordable healthcare, and really creating a level playing field for business. I mean, I'm always really confused when people suggest that vigorously enforcing the antitrust laws is somehow bad for business, because actually it's small and medium businesses and entrepreneurs and startups that most need a level playing field to make sure that they're not getting crushed by the big monopolies.
I know that you just have a few weeks left in this administration, but one of the main projects that you guys are focusing on right now has to do with junk fees. So can you speak on that, what the FTC is doing here?
We just finalized a rule that would ban junk fees. And these are basically those fees that come up at the very end of the process. Think service fees or convenience fees or resort fees. You don't actually know what you're necessarily getting for this fee, but you have no choice but to pay it if you want to
Right.
buy the product or service. And so we just issued a rule that would eliminate these in live event tickets and short-term lodging. So think hotels, short-term vacation stays. We estimate this is going to save Americans over 50 million hours a year in just wasted time where you're trying to figure out what is the price I'm actually supposed to pay, as well as $11 billion over the next decade. As we went through this proposal, we heard a lot of complaints about junk fees across the economy. This rule, we were able to get over the finish line, focused on these two sectors. We had a bipartisan vote, and we think that will help ensure its durability in the coming months and years. But there's still a lot more work to be done here to take on these junk fees. And so I hope enforcers and lawmakers will make sure Americans are protected across the economy from these illegal fees.
And obviously, this is something that touches everybody who's ever, bought anything online, but especially with regard to ticketing for events and also rentals. And so, when does that go into effect? And what can people do if they continue to see service fees or any other junk fees pop up even after it's gone into effect?
This is going to go into effect around April. And if you still see these deceptive fees, you'll be able to report it to the FTC or to state attorneys general, and they'll be able to take action. And because of this rule, they're not just going to do some type of slap on the wrist. They're actually going to be able to issue pretty significant penalties, which will be significant too.
Well, to that point, I do want to talk about some of what you've accomplished at the FTC here. So you started off speaking a little bit about the Albertsons Kroger merger. Another big step that you've taken at the FTC is housing prices, which are obviously a huge concern among Americans right now. What happened with Invitation Homes?
So this was an enforcement action that we brought the other month. Invitation Homes is the largest owner of single family homes in the United States. So, thousands, if thousands upon Americans have Invitation Homes effectively as their landlord. And we found that they were engaging in a whole set of really exploitative practices. Just to give you an example, so Invitation Homes would advertise rents as relatively low, and that would prompt people to come in to look at the homes. Then they would find out, after having already paid the application fee, that there were hundreds of dollars in additional fees. And so you had people that were suddenly paying upwards of $1,000 more in rent than what Invitation Homes had actually advertised. And so we saw basically a bait and switch. We also saw just a host of really exploitative practices where Invitation Homes would promise that it would do timely repairs, and instead people would not be able to get anybody to come fix, sewers, plumbing, heat, leading to all sorts of really awful conditions. We also had Invitation Homes basically deceive people during the pandemic. There were basically policies in place that protected people from evictions. And Invitation Homes, instead of making it widely known that people didn't have to be kicked out of their homes during the pandemic, kept that information from them, actually resulting in evictions that people should have been protected from. So these were a whole set of illegal practices that we held the company to account.
The FTC's Invitation Homes complaint cited a 2019 email from the Invitation Homes CEO calling on the senior vice president responsible for overseeing the company's junk fee program, and this is a quote, to juice this hog by making the smart home fee mandatory for renters. Does seeing a quote like that kind of give you a sense of justification for going after people who were very clearly looking just to exploit people for the sake of padding their bottom line as much as humanly possible?
I mean, certainly those types of quotes, especially from high-level executives, from people at the very top levels of a company, can give you important insight into what the intention was, what the motive was, what the overall game plan here was. And it really gets to this broader issue that we're seeing with junk fees across the economy, that as firms are relying more on, services and subscription-based revenues, they're tacking all sorts of junk fees on people that are significantly inflating the cost that Americans pay. I mean, junk fees collectively cost Americans billions of dollars a year. And so it's really important that when these fees are illegal, enforcers crack down.
I do want to read another quote, and this is separate and apart from Invitation Homes, but there was an insurance executive, USAP and Welsh Carson. This is a private equity firm that dealt with anesthesiology practices in Texas, said that acquisitions would serve the purpose where they would take the highest rate of all and then peanut butter spread that across the entire state of Texas. So again, how often do you see this type of language that shows these corporate executives kind of not just engaging in exploitative practices, but the language that they use showing that it's really little more than a joke to them, and it's almost a way for them to beat their chests about what they're doing?
Yeah, it's such an important point. And honestly, sometimes it's quite shocking that not only are companies engaging in these illegal behaviors, but they're talking about them in the ways that you just noted. And I think it really underscores that, honestly, for decades, there had been so much under enforcement that executives and businesses didn't think that they necessarily had to closely pay attention to the law. And
Right.
that's what this administration and the FTC over the last few years has really focused on making sure we're getting across that following the law is not optional, right? And we're going to enforce the law without fear or favor across the economy if we see law breaking. We've heard from some of these executives, from some of these businesses that haven't been happy with the fact that we've been so assertive, that this really is having an impact on the market. It's really making companies think twice about, for example, whether to pursue illegal mergers or engage in other types of tactics. And that type of deterrence is incredibly important. And I hope we would see continued commitment to it.
Can you talk a little bit more about the other accomplishments that you've been able to notch at the FTC, like for example, the cost of inhalers?
Yeah, I mean, it's been pretty tremendous to see how much we've been able to get done over the last few years. On inhalers, our team identified that there were all sorts of patent tricks that some of the big pharma companies were pursuing that practically meant Americans were paying hundreds of dollars out of pocket for inhalers, even though people in other countries were paying as little as $7. So we challenged some of these patent tricks, and it ultimately led three of the four big inhaler manufacturers to say that they're going to drop how much Americans pay out of pocket to just $35, down from hundreds of dollars. And we've already heard from people who kind of went to their pharmacy, were kind of expecting to see this big bill, and saw instead that the inhaler now was only costing them $35. So this is real money back in people's pockets. We've also been very active in focusing on just all of these subscription tricks and traps that we see where companies will make it very easy to sign up for a subscription, but extraordinarily difficult to cancel. And these tactics, too, also mean that Americans are sometimes paying dozens, if not hundreds of dollars a month for service that they're actually looking to end. Nobody should be stuck paying for a subscription that they want to exit. And so we finalized a rule that would require that businesses make it as easy to cancel a subscription as it is to sign up for one. Separate from the rule, we've brought a whole bunch of lawsuits going after companies for these types of illegal behaviors, including a lawsuit against Adobe for these types of subscription traps, as well as against Amazon. So those are just a couple of the areas where we've been active, but really there's a pretty long list there.
And I mean, a lot of this stuff is the actual stuff that makes up the real inconveniences or worse, like completely devastating, catastrophic impacts on people's lives on a daily basis. This is really the stuff that touches people the most. Do you have reason to feel confident about whether the FTC's mission will continue under Ferguson to focus on exactly what you've been focusing on thus far? Do you have any way to read the tea leaves about whether we can see more enforcement action, or you're just, there's no way to tell one way or the other?
Yeah, I mean, I'll leave it to others to do those types of protections. I don't know what the future is going to hold. I do know we have, career civil servants that are very committed to enforcing the law without fear or favor. We also have several law enforcement actions underway. And so I would hope that we would see those continue, be it in the healthcare sector, be it in, digital markets. I think it's going to be incredibly important that we don't see a backsliding where instead of protecting people from monopoly abuse and corporate law breaking, we instead see enforcers go lax.
You have been one of the few administration officials who's really stood out in a position where the American people wouldn't normally have known who was occupying a certain office. I mean, I think we saw it, really with very few offices where we really had a standout person in charge. And I think that you, probably above anybody else, has really had the biggest impact in terms of, focusing on protecting consumers and blocking these unfair trade practices. What do you hope that your legacy is going to be as you reach the end of your tenure as chair of the FTC?
The one thing that I really prioritized during my time as chair was making sure that we were hearing from Americans across the country. And that means getting out of the Beltway. I mean, it's very easy in these types of jobs to just hear from a very insulated community of, business executives and, people with a lot of power and influence in DC. And we instead did listening sessions across the country, right? We went to places like Baraboo, Wisconsin, to Longwood, Colorado, to sit down with farmers and ranchers and hear about the challenges they faced. We went to, Silicon Valley to hear from startups and founders, heard from, independent repair shops that just want the chance to repair products. We heard from parents who have lost kids to all sorts of predatory practices on social media. And so really focused on directly centering Americans in our work and making sure we were using our resources to take on the biggest pain points. I think the other area where we've seen change is antitrust can seem very arcane, very technical, right? What are these laws really about? And over the last few years, we've seen a greater recognition of how decisions that people make at places like the FTC have a huge impact on people's lives, right? It can affect how much people are paying at the grocery store. It can affect whether people are having to drive 5 miles or 50 miles to go to the hospital. It can affect just what your day-to-day experience is of being a consumer, right? Are there all these indignities and traps that you have to navigate? Are you always having to look out around the corner to figure out, am I about to be scammed? And so making sure that people recognize that what their day-to-day looks like in those regards is not some inevitability, but instead is a result of decisions and choices that people at the FTC, at all sorts of agencies and government make, is incredibly important because it means that people can then hold policymakers and enforcers to account.
What's next for you?
Well, look, we still have a few more weeks of this administration, and right now we're just focused on using every minute that we have to get stuff done. So that's still the current focus.
All right. Well. Look, I know I speak for a lot of people. By the way, left, right, and center, across the political spectrum, in just wanting to offer some thanks for the work that you and the commission more broadly has done during the Biden administration. I think that, as you mentioned when you were just speaking about the last answer there, the impact that you've had on regular people's lives cannot be overstated. Whether it's on the cost of rent for renters, whether it's on the cost of inhalers, whether it's on banning non-competes, whether it's on keeping grocery prices low. So really the work you've done is exactly what we should hope for with a public servant. So just extending my thanks, and on behalf of a vast audience that extends across the political spectrum, thanks from all of us out here. So appreciate your time, appreciate all the work that you've done at the FTC, and very much looking forward to seeing where you end up after this administration's over.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor to get to lead the FTC and really appreciate you having me on your show.